Notes in Unit 9, Part 2 are going to discuss everything from after Pearl Harbor until the end of the United States involvement in World War II. After we engaged in war at Pearl Harbor, we were united in anger and joined forces towards a total war effort at home. So we had our economy, our people, our government, all behind the war effort. Before we even entered the war, we had our first peacetime draft in 1940. A draft is an involuntary decision for men between the ages of 21 and up to be chosen to go to war. In 1942, after we're already involved with World War II, they actually lower the age to be drafted from 21 to 18. So now that expanded how many people they would tell need to join the Army. The economy really boosted the war effort at home and helped to kind of drag us out of the Great Depression. Wartime manufacturing to produce weapons and different materials necessary for war caused an increase in need for labor, which led to job openings for many people. So people were leaving to join the war effort, leaving their jobs, and so this opened up original jobs, and then we're going to have more jobs created on top of that. So you see a change in the workforce. Women and African Americans are going to join the workforce to fill those roles. Now, when people have jobs, they have more money to spend, so this is going to help the economy grow in the United States and pull itself out of the Great Depression. In addition to an increase in labor force, in addition of wartime manufacturing, the government is also going to call people to conserve resources through rationing. Rationing is basically when the country says that you can only purchase so much of a product. And they usually did this through the way of stamps to keep track of how much milk you could buy, or how much flour, or how much corn or wheat, rubber, fabric, many things that could go towards helping the war effort. So this combination of less stuff that people could buy and also making more money led to individual economic growth for the future. So people really started to pull themselves out of the hole, and you see a larger middle class as a result. African Americans were not part of the draft. They still faced widespread discrimination in our country, and they felt like they wouldn't be loyal to the military. But they did eventually have a quota that they needed to meet for the draft. So whatever percentage of the population was African American, they wanted that same percentage to be represented in the Army. So if 10% of the country's population was African American, then 10% of the military needed to be African American as well. However, most of these draftees did not become actual military personnel. They were mostly labor positions and support positions that kind of left them at an inferior status. Those that were actually in the lines fighting were in segregated troops, often in the Navy, still showing large racial differences in treatment in the military. Women played a new role in the war as they developed their own corps within the Army. So women were actually legally allowed to fight in this one. They joined the Women Army Auxiliary Corps, or WAAC, and contributed not only in support roles, but also by fighting in the war itself. This is a quote from a military official. The contribution of the women of America, whether on the farm or in the factory or in uniform, to D-Day was the sine qua non of the invasion effort. So they were a critical part in many different aspects. They fought in uniform, they drove trucks, repaired important devices, became nurses, and then also fulfilled jobs that men left at home. So women really start to take on a role and feel like they're becoming socially equal. However, at the end of the war, women had a difficult time maintaining equality with men. A lot of times their jobs were taken away. They didn't really get full respect and praise for what they had done. They didn't really get credit for it. So temporarily during the war, they felt like they were on the same level as men, but once the war's over and they were no longer needed per se, they had difficulty maintaining that equality status. A dark period of our history is the Japanese internment camps. As we spoke before in class, one of the effects of Pearl Harbor was the view and treatment of the Japanese and Japanese Americans. And they actually had a government-mandated relocation of Japanese Americans to internment camps, which are basically concentration camps. So 127,000 Japanese Americans were in prison just for being of Japanese ancestry. They felt like they were a threat to our country and wouldn't be loyal based on that. Pearl Harbor also caused widespread anti-Japanese paranoia, this fear that they were going to attack from within. Most Japanese were located on the west coast of the country. Immigration purposes, it's closer. That's why there's more Europeans on the east coast. Europe is closer to that coast. So most of these camps were located throughout the west coast. So they were forced into relocation into these camps. And 2/3 of these people were actually American-born. There's an error there. It should be American-born or Nisei. So they were American-born citizens but just had the ancestry from Japan. So what was life in a camp like? It was difficult. It was uncomfortable. The location of these were very desolate. They had extreme weather conditions, either very hot or very cold, making it difficult to live. Also close living quarters with food that was mass-produced, often very unhealthy, unsatisfying. And if they tried to escape, they would be shot. So it's very much like prison. And these people didn't do anything. So the sadness that was felt by the Japanese people and the disappointment and shame that our country feels for these acts, for forcibly imprisoning people based off of their ancestry, is very clear. There's actually a court case, Korematsu versus the United States, that questioned whether they could actually do this. The country said that it was a wartime necessity, that Japanese people were a threat, that we wouldn't know if they were loyal or not. This order was actually repealed eventually, but many people could not return home because the areas they lived in were so hostile or angry or dangerous towards Japanese Americans, so they felt unsafe living there. The United States did attempt to apologize in 1988, awarding $20,000 to surviving people from these internment camps. We're very shameful of this action, and it's something that isn't talked a lot about amongst our culture. We tend to focus on the Holocaust and what other people did that was so outstanding, but this is something that happened in our own country. We imprisoned our own people simply because of how they look, and it really is an example of a failure to respect the civil liberties of people and to really go against our Constitution and that all people are created equal, and to not accept cultural differences. Here are some pictures of the Japanese internment camps, signs to notify that anybody of Japanese ancestry is to be relocated, causing tension and discrimination in those towns. They couldn't go back. Here's a family packed up, relocating, and here you can see how people are forced into these tiny quarters. So this is a real thing that our country did. I'm going to mention briefly the Holocaust. This is something that you could spend an entire semester talking about, and many of you have talked about it every year, and also in language arts, and it is worth mentioning just so that even if you don't know the basic facts. Now you do. The Holocaust was a mass murder of 6 million European Jewish people, as well as other persecuted groups, such as homosexuals, gypsies, and this is by the German Nazi regime in World War II. So these people are basically forced into concentration camps where they're stripped of anything that would identify them and oftentimes eventually killed. The point of this was a genocide, and a genocide is violence with the purpose of killing off a particular group of people, and in this case, the Jewish people. So why did something like this happen? Hitler felt that the Jewish people were an inferior race and a threat to German racial purity. So he had an idea of what the perfect German race was like, and he wanted to keep the German culture only to that race. And the Jewish people, he felt, were threatening that. There are also arguments that he felt that the Jewish people were responsible for the economic disaster of Germany and blamed them for basically being successful at others' expense, which is not necessarily true. So something very extreme and horrifying in pretty recent history. And many of you have seen pictures, watched movies, read books about this time period, and just how sad it is that people were killed off just for being of a certain culture that was different than what one person felt was ideal. Here are some pictures of from the Holocaust. There is a concentration camp, the gate to it. People imprisoned wearing similar clothes. They had to wear a sign of the Jewish star to show that they were Jewish. People were malnourished to the point where they could die just from that rather than the gas chambers, as you can see in these pictures, in very tight quarters as well. So we're going to talk a minute about Iwo Jima, and then we'll talk about Hiroshima. So Iwo Jima was one of the first, it was a major U.S. victory. Japanese strategy was to fight below ground. There ended up being absolutely no Japanese survivors. This is an example of suicide missions or kamikazes. They fought knowing that this would happen. Their goal is to kill at least 10 Americans before being killed themselves. So this is the first time that Japan had been successfully conquered by a foreign body, and it was a U.S. victory. For the U.S., Iwo Jima Island was a midway point between Tokyo and their base in the Marianas, so it was a very important island to take over. Iwo Jima is important because of the number of casualties that the United States had, and also because of how large of a victory it is. And there's a very famous statue that demonstrates this picture in Washington, D.C. And this is a very famous photo of our soldiers